Welcome to this roundtable. My name is Fiona Dove. I'm the director of the Transnational Institute, which is coordinated from Amsterdam. TNI, as we call it, TNI's mission is to serve as a knowledge resource for progressive social movements around the world. And today we've organized this roundtable to discuss a new report, which is published by TNI and Friends of the Earth International. The title of the report is 3 COVID Crises and Multistakeholderism, and the author is Dr. Harris Gleckman. The context for the report is the myriad of interlinked mega crises that the world is currently experiencing. And of these, Harris focuses primarily on 2: the systemic impacts of COVID and the challenges to institutions of global governance, which are discernible in the trend towards multistakeholderism. I'll introduce Harris and our 2 discussants in a moment, but first I will let Katana Chandrasekaran say a few words of welcome to you on behalf of Friends of the Earth International. Katana.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and a very warm welcome to everyone for this crucial webinar. A warm welcome from Friends of the Earth International. I'm Kirtana Chandrasekaran from FOI, as we are called, which is the world's largest grassroots environmental justice federation. We have 73 national members of our federation who do environmental justice work based from the communities upwards, and millions of members and supporters around the world. And our mission is to ensure environmental and social justice, human dignity, human rights, and ensure people's rights for sustainable societies and people's participation and sovereignty in the way that we achieve our goals. So a very warm welcome. And ironically, I'm attending this webinar having COVID myself, as so many people across the world are again now. While many of our governments, for example, where I am here in the UK, have just abandoned their responsibility or any sense of justice in how we deal with this pandemic, as they did from the start. And this important webinar gives us some insight, I think, into the reasons why this might be happening, how it's happening, and how we can actually start to deal with the root causes of what's happening here. For us at Friends of the Earth International, of course, all of the work we do is intertwined. So we have climate justice, food sovereignty, which cannot be achieved without health justice, without enabling ourselves to have functioning justice-based democracies where people feel their rights can be fulfilled. And tackling this crisis of multi-stakeholderism and the capture of global governance by this kind of new framing of how the corporate capture takes place is absolutely crucial for us to be able to achieve any of our goals. So I'm very, very glad to be having this webinar, and welcome.
Thank you, Kirtana, and I hope you feel better soon. I'm going to introduce now the Harris and the 2 discussants. Harris Gleckman is the author, as I mentioned. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Governance and Sustainability at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and he's also director of Benchmark Environmental Consulting. Harris has a PhD in sociology from Brandeis University, and he used to work for the UN Center on Transnational Corporations. He was the head of the New York office of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and he was an early member of the staff for the 2002 Monterey Conference on Financing for Development. Harris is also an associate of the Transnational Institute. The discussants today, and we're really pleased to have both of them with us. The first is Lauren Paremoer. Lauren is a senior lecturer at the University of Cape Town. She's the coordinator of the health governance program of the People's Health Movement in South Africa. And her research focuses on health activism, global governance of health, and political mobilization aimed at realizing social citizenship in global South societies in relation to the struggle for the right to HIV/AIDS treatment in South Africa, the social reproduction work undertaken by women, and the use of for-profit markets and philanthropic capitalism to ameliorate the worst effects of deteriorating public health systems. So Lauren is very well positioned to discuss Harris's paper with him. The other discussant is Priti Patnaik. Priti is a journalist. She's the founding editor of the Geneva Health Files. This is a weekly investigative newsletter that tracks power and politics in global health. In her 20 years in journalism, she has reported on global health, international trade, finance, and illicit financial flows. She's worked as a reporter in Geneva, New York, Delhi, and otherwise she's worked at a UN public health agency. Priti has a master's in development studies from the Geneva Graduate Institute and a master's degree in business and economic reporting from New York University. And she did her undergrad work in a whole other field, in microbiology, genetics, and chemistry. And she did this at Osmania University in India. So Priti and Lauren, a very warm welcome to both of you. And Harris, let's get started with you and tell us about the report and your analysis of the links between these two crises that you're addressing.
Let me get the right screen sharing going here.
Can you make it full?
Yes, I'm trying to switch to that and it's not there yet. Hold on, what am I doing? It was working a moment ago. Please bear with me for a second here while I try and fix this. Well, that's what we're going to have to work with. Sorry about that. I don't see what I'm doing wrong all of a sudden. Let me try again. Sorry. Let me restart it. Your patience, please.
Harris, if you go very down on the right bottom, very down to the, yeah, there you go, to the left, there's a button to the right. So the rightest one, not this one, the next to the right, next to the right, next to the right, the next to the right, and this one, yes.
Good. Thank you.
Still not what we wanted.
Let me reverse it. Are we okay now?
Yes, that's the one. Thank you.
Sorry. All the preparation and then something goes askew. Welcome. I appreciate very much the opportunity to join the conversation today and appreciate the introductions. It's not an easy time to be living. We are, as Fiona noted earlier, surrounded by a whole range of complicated events and crises. And how do we explain what's going on? The report tries to help provide some context for two of these and offers some ideas on how to respond to them. And I'm looking forward to the conversation with everyone on these two crises. First of which is the challenge to the institutions of global governance. We have historically a state-censored system of global governance captured in multilateralism, which is now confronting a more explicit corporate-centered form of global governance called multistakeholderism. Multistakeholderism really is a system where the governance process is moved to a group made up of TNCs, TNC-related associations, and the handpicked representatives they chose from civil society, governments, academia, and other places. The scope of the work of multi-stakeholderism stretches from setting standards, developing policies, making projects work, and financing them. What's interesting here is the relationship between multistakeholderism, and multilateralism. Sometimes they're at arm's length from each other. In some occasions, multistakeholderism turns to multilateralism because they want the appearance of legitimacy and they want the resources of the multilateral system. Sometimes the multilateral system now is calling for multi-stakeholder groups to deliver things which in the past, the multilateral institutions would have been the leaders, and sometimes they are in direct conflict with each other. We're going to look at how this happens within the global effort to govern COVID. In the spring of this year, the structure of ACT-A, which is the accelerator to COVID-19 tools, or access, sorry, to COVID-19 tools accelerator, had 5 groups. 4 of those groups were clearly being led by other multi-stakeholder groups. The 5th was being led by the World Health Organization. The structure of ACT-A continues to evolve, and they have recently dropped the PPE group. But let's get a look at how much multi-stakeholderism is the central part of how the governance of COVID responses, particularly North-South, is occurring. These same organizations who are in the leadership, some are multi-stakeholder groups, some are multi-stakeholder funding groups or corporate foundations, others are transnational corporations. And you see the predominant role that this form of governance has taken. How do they see the multilateral system? For the most part, they see the multilateral system as supporting roles for multilateralism. So the General Assembly hosted a summit. UNICEF is a deliverer. The World Health Assembly and the WTO are not even mentioned. And the Secretariat of the WHO has various supportive and leadership roles. But how does this all happen? It happens because governments have now chosen to provide their resources for addressing COVID to COVAX, one of the key components of ACT-A. In fact, the most recent report, this table comes from the first of these reports that Friends of the Earth International and Transnational Institute have published on COVID power. The most recent report shows that government funding for COVAX is probably in the 80 or 90% level now. So what we're seeing is a redefinition of what is global governance. And multi-stakeholder groups in COVID are clearly taking the lead. The multilateral system, the Secretary General now calls for and wants to call it UN.2 because they have a partnership with the World Health Organization. And he's been calling on governments and other donors to underwrite COVAX. WHO remains underfunded in any effort to try to respond to global COVID. WTO gets to define when it's a health emergency. The World Bank and the IMF craft emergency debt financing in order to make payments to COVAX. And I'd like to suggest that these conversations, which are being sponsored by both organizations, are a beginning of what should be and can be seen as democratic global governance. The second part of the report and today's conversation is an effort to develop an analytic narrative on how the powerful are responding to COVID and how it impacts on the global South. To get there, it's necessary to realize that we have 3 different ways the international community is using the expression COVID crisis. In the first instance, it's a viral reality that moves from one living organism or from a lab to a living organism and passes. The second level of a COVID crisis is how this viral reality moves in a class, ethnic, gender, highly structured society of inequities. And the third level of the use of the expression is how powerful institutions choose to respond to the systemic COVID crisis. This results in 4 different ways that the institutions of power respond to systemic crisis. Now, let me give you an overview, and then I will step back and share some more details. The first of 4 responses is to protect globalization from any special exceptions. The second is to use the reality of COVID to expand markets and to expand political power. The third is to just stand back and let people die because of non-action. And the fourth is to take actions which mitigate the systemic consequences. Let's look at more carefully at some of these. Protecting globalization from any special exemptions. We're all well aware of the debate in the World Health Trade Organization, who is saying that even in the face of the devastation of the COVID crisis, the rules of globalization have to be preserved. In part, this is because the system is saying, if we were to grant that COVID crisis requires adapting, waiving rules, then it would apply to the climate crisis, to dealing with inequality, to dealing with a whole range of other global crises. And so the push is to protect globalization. Another example of this is that contracts written in non-crisis terms in the oxygen market, for example, in individual countries, will say, you can only, if we supply you with that oxygen to treat your patients, you can buy it from no one else. But we cannot produce enough oxygen for the devastation that you are facing. And the push is to protect the rights of contracts. The second response is to expand markets and the power of the already powerful. There are lots of new products, lots of subsidiary markets being created, and all are conveying the message that in order to have what should be a global public good requires being paid for, and that is the role of expanding the market. In terms of the power of the powerful, COVID, access to vaccines, access to treatments, access to the whole range of medical supplies is being used in geopolitical terms as a battle between the West, China, Russia, and India. It's turned a health crisis into a geopolitical battle. Third kind of response of power is to stand back and let people of the South die and other marginalized people. And let me come back to elaborate on that. But it's very important to say that there's also a response by some of the powerful to go and address these issues. There's a hospital in Texas, the Texas Children's Hospital, has developed a vaccine which they've made open source. Oxford University and an organization called FINE says if you're going to use any of our things, we have an open approach to intellectual property. And it's possible for global governments to say, we're going to use some of our budget revenues or even our military budgets to purchase the quantity of medical needs to address the global need, particularly the global need in the South. So there are positive ways in which powerful can respond. And these are the four main ones. The issue of standing back is perhaps best seen as a new form of warfare. When the world started, there was a recognition of vaccine nationalism very clearly brought out by the World Health Organization. And it's also, now we're watching the same thing in terms of treatments. This is a systemic response. And it's particularly the case where systemic non-action is actually a very powerful action. And that's when it's clear that there's available knowledge that could be used to address these issues. And the knowledge is available about the consequences of non-action. And the structure of the power relationships means that that is what happens. And that is perhaps useful to recognize this as an extension of other prior forms of warfare. There are domestic, where blocking access to areas of their food were considered acts of war. And in the realities of now, it may be worth considering that we have a new third form of warfare called the silent warfare. In some authoritarian countries, this same approach is being used for marginalized peoples within those countries. But there are ways of responding. And the paper makes a large number of suggestions of how to do that, because it's important that we organize within this frame of narrative, if that is what sounds like it helps explain the current behavior that we are watching. Just want to flag a number to counter the expansion of TNC markets. The narrative response to that is to make clear that a global public good, particularly in a crisis, should not require people have to pay for their health care. Another kind of response, and there are many others in the paper, is to campaign to have the WHO have a formal seat at the WTO Council. And when facing a pandemic, maybe it should be the WHO who has the legal capacity to declare suspension of trade and investment rules rather than the WTO. And there are other similar suggestions throughout the paper. One of the elements to look at is whether this analytic narrative is also helpful in explaining other global crises and the claims that the North has made that they are fighting. I would like to thank the People's Working Group on Multistakeholderism, who are an association of many organizations trying to understand the politics and the changes in global governance and how to put in front of the discussion the concept of a democratic global governance system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harris. Lauren, I think you've had some discussions with Harris, and from your own experience in your work with the People's Health Movement, I think you have some points you'd like to raise with Harris, or things that you might like to debate with Harris.
Thanks, Fiona, and thank you to TNI, Friends of the Earth, and Harris for the invitation. So I'd like to start with two ideas from the report. One is this idea that the systemic COVID crisis and the power COVID crisis are both socially created realities, and as such, they can be altered by human interventions. And I want to start with that because it's a kind of hopeful point in an otherwise very bleak report. And then the other idea that I want to start with is this idea that the virus has provided the lethality, but the North has insisted that the money economy should be the terms on which life, health, and death decisions are made. And that's an important idea, I think, because it provides some guidance as to what we need to focus on if we're going to undo the systemic COVID crisis and the power COVID crisis. And I think also that second insight helps to provide context to what Harris mentioned briefly, which is the fact that this pandemic is deeply racialized and gendered. Marginalized communities have suffered the brunt of inadequate access to COVID-19 technologies and decision-making power. And so I think there's something quite remarkable about that, because if we think of a previous health crisis, the HIV/AIDS crisis, one of the key slogans there was "nothing about us without us." And I think what we're seeing with the COVID pandemic, the COVID crisis, is a real loss of that political principle. And the report brings that out very, very clearly. So with these ideas in mind, I want to turn to the question of how the power analysis in the report helps us to see the governance dynamics that have emerged over the past 2 years differently. So first, I think the report illustrates a key shift in global governance of health, and that's the extent to which transnational corporations, also other non-state actors like charitable foundations, but how their political influence, which is a long-standing reality, has now escalated into full-blown governance through the creation of MSI's multi-stakeholder initiatives like COVAX. So during the pandemic, I think transnational corporations, most obviously pharma, have been given authority, that is legitimate power, to make binding decisions about the terms on which essential goods should be produced, distributed, and manufactured. And so significantly, they were given this power not only on the basis of their market monopolies, but as the report illustrates, as a result of being given a seat at the decision-making table. So in COVAX and more broadly Act A. And of course, at the same time, intergovernmental organizations and governments, member states of the World Health Organization, have been kept away from the decision-making table. And so I think in practical terms, this points to quite a significant shift in terms of what we can think of as a obligatory passage point for governing health crises. So before, once we defined something as a health crisis, it had to pass through a specific UN institution, the World Health Organization, and all national governments to be seen as something that could be defined and rendered governable. I think what we see now is that these entities have largely been reduced to offering technical assistance. And the new norm seems to be that once something is defined as a health emergency, it becomes visible and governable by passing through a governance infrastructure dominated by pharma, the World Trade Organization, and northern governments. And so now these are the deciders, and states generally, particularly states in the Global South and the World Health Organization, seem to be positioned as helpers, right? So they contribute the kind of technical infrastructure, but are largely marginalized from decision-making processes. And I think that's a really problematic dynamic that the report exposes. So basically, I think the report shows that we're in this extreme moment of conflating economic and political power. And even beyond that, that the conflation is regarded as necessary. So it's somehow framed, these multi-stakeholder initiatives are somehow framed as the only alternative we have to respond to health emergencies, health crises. And so if that old slogan, there is no alternative, used to apply to globalization, I think that maxim has now been extended and imported into the use of multi-stakeholder initiatives to govern global crises. So the second shift that I think the report highlights is this trend in the kind of narrative of transnational corporations positioning themselves as being free from the need to be regulated. In the report, this is framed as the stand back response. And of course, this is also something that has been going on for a long time. But I think one of the things to think about, and this I don't think is mentioned in the report, is that perhaps something like the UN binding treaty on transnational corporations is an area of possible intervention and pushing back against this kind of attitude. And then I also want to add that while the report does focus on how this approach of standing back literally results in letting people die, what it calls this inexpensive silent war, one can also add that there might be a need to focus on the entrepreneurialism of transnational corporations in this kind of standing back space that is created. And so I think they're being very entrepreneurial in terms of signaling the kind of multi-stakeholder initiatives they want in the future. And I think the recent Berlin declaration of the IFPMA is one illustrative example where it cites a number of things that Big Pharma is willing to do, but also a number of things that they require, and this is the language in the declaration, of governments in order to express that willingness. So I think that's something else to keep in mind. And then just to wrap up, because I can see my time is running out. I think the report rightly points out that pandemics have emerged as major opportunities for market making. And it focuses on that practice at the global scale. I think one of the things to think about is how this market making is proceeding in developing countries, in countries of the global south. And I'm mentioning this particularly in relation to conversations about tech transfer and local production of pharmaceuticals. So this, of course, is seen legitimately so as one of the ways to break the power of dominant players in the existing market. But I think also from a Southern perspective, we need to think about to what extent is tech transfer going to become a new site of market making, a new site of multi-stakeholderism in the global South, rather than something that's genuinely concerned with the production of public goods and defending health as a public good and not as a commodity. And then finally, just my very last point. I think one of the key narratives that the report highlights, and Harris mentioned this in his presentation, is this idea that health is a global public good. So the way it's phrased in the report is that health is a global public good, not one that requires patients to pay directly. And so here I would actually add a provocation and say that we need to maybe alter the frame a little bit, and to say that it's not health, but healthcare. So the management of illness and morbidity, that's something that should be seen as a global public good. We shouldn't pay for it, but that we should also expand our focus and think of health as something much broader than healthcare, as something much broader than managing illness. It's health in the sense of health for all, in the sense of achieving the highest attainable state of well-being. And I think when we have conversations about multi-stakeholder initiatives, it's somehow, sometimes we zoom in on technical aspects and things like access to care. And I think these are important, but I think always central to our conversation should be this idea that health is much bigger than that, and that it intersects with the other crises, so the food, climate, caregiving, biodiversity crises that are acknowledged in the report. And this really is, I think this focus on health is an entry point for solidarity, along with activists working on those other crisis issues. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Lauren. We'll come back to the points also in the Q&A. I noticed that there seems to be a problem with the Q&A. Juliana, perhaps you could take a look at that. Preeti, would you like to give your comments on the paper?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining, and thanks so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here to discuss this. Thanks also to Harris and Lauren for their comments. I think, first off, the strength of the report is really that there have been not so much of scrutiny or examination on the underlying politics of multi-stakeholderism. So I'm very grateful for your efforts. It's somewhat of an accepted reality, at least here in Geneva, and it's not fashionable to question multi-stakeholderism, at least here. So I'm grateful that you've been doggedly mapping what some say is an inevitable shift. And maybe there is sort of a certain degree of inevitability in all this, and we'll come to that perhaps in the Q&A, with constrained finances from governments, and the kind of governments that have money and the kind of initiatives that get funded. And this has been illustrated in the difficult conversations, for example, around WHO financing that we have witnessed recently. So having said that, I think the report really captures the complexity that existed before COVID-19, but also revealed to an extent, it's as if COVID-19 sort of seeped into every crevice and broken system possible. And it really shows the multi-layered effects of COVID-19. And of course, I think the viral reality, as you say, has captured much of public imagination and response from technical agencies. And the systemic crisis also that people have been witnessing because they are part of certain social, economic and political structures. And they have been really vulnerable, as you point out. But I think the most interesting articulation for me in the report is the power COVID crisis, as you say. And again, spectacularly seen in places like Geneva. And even after 2.5 years, I feel that we haven't discussed this much because, as I said, it's an accepted reality. And you say basically that the power COVID crisis is a consequence of powerful actors, including some governments, the UN system, the transnational companies and their associated bodies, based on their own perceptions of their institutional priorities and interests. And this is really interesting because really it has what we've witnessed is people, as I've said, coming to bake their own bread. It doesn't matter what's the usefulness of their overall initiatives to the larger public interest. And you say that the governance issues here are the way powerful actors act to intervene or not to alter the impact of the systemic COVID crisis. And we've seen here, recently, the powers of status quo, as it were, especially at the WTO, the way power was wielded at the WTO to ensure normal operations of globalization, as you say. And I remember having a recent conversation with an ambassador here, a trade ambassador here in Geneva, and he said that, we could not have discarded the rule book. And he was obviously talking about the narrow outcome on the TRIPS waiver negotiations. And that's exactly what what you've referred to in the book as how our response has been so straitjacketed, by these existing powers, as it were. And you divide the power responses to a number of different categories, some of which you've touched upon in your presentation today. The global demand for medical goods, in unprecedented global demand, and that really worked in favor of the industry and governments. And the sad part is governments were not able to actually translate this demand into latitude, which should have worked in their favor, but they failed to negotiate effectively. And then you mentioned, of course, about geopolitics and vaccine diplomacy. You also talk about procurement power, which I think is interesting. From companies to big UN agencies, they did have a lot of power, but they were not effectively able to address questions like liability, for example. That was a major failure, particularly for populations at the receiving end of humanitarian assistance. And I'm glad you mentioned this today in your report as well, in your presentation as well, that even though we were at the peak of the pandemic, the fundamental operating assumption of COVAX was medical care has to be purchased by those in need. And that's absolutely right. And if you think back 2.5 years ago, there were very, very few people who actually raised questions about COVAX, the limitations of the COVAX facility. And there were maybe a handful of people really. And I remember getting a call from a major CSO actually saying that, why are you criticizing the COVAX facility? Let's give them a chance. But we know that by design, the COVAX facility had its limitation because of the kind of governance that you delve so well in your report. And the other thing I wanted to really underscore for our listeners here today is your sort of analysis of the oxygen industry that really illustrates what this power means on the ground when governments were really bound by these long-term contracts and unable to sort of use local suppliers or as you say, on-site local oxygen extraction. They couldn't do all that because they were bound by these long-term contracts. So that's interesting, and I invite listeners to look at your analysis on this. And just quickly, I'm over my time on multi-stakeholderism governance. The elephant in the room, in some sense, as we speak, the ACT Accelerator is going to be sunsetted, as it were, later in the fall. They are going to shift from response to long-term COVID care, but it has its limitations, and I'm just wondering whether this is a moment where countries have actually realized the limitations. We will see the ACT Accelerator going forward, particularly some form of the ACT Accelerator going forward, particularly in discussions, in the context of a new pandemic accord that is being negotiated at the WHO. This has come up several times during the last few months. And I think that even the strategic review of the ACT Accelerator found the difficulties in fixing accountability. All of this is highly diffused, and it's very difficult to fix accountability because as you lay out the various constellation of actors in the institutional setup of the ACT Accelerator, I think it's about page 18 in the report, and I urge your listeners to look at that. And also your mapping of the World Economic Forum's COVID Action Platform. That's remarkable. All the kind of forces, they have identified opportunities that Lawrence said was, entrepreneurial, really entrepreneurial in nature. It's instructive to see how opportunistic this has been for them. Finally, I'll actually just sort of wrap up on this question of, why is this important, and can we actually walk away from something like this, and are governments willing to walk away from something like this? And what we have noticed in recent discussions is that governments have owned it. Increasingly, number of governments, including in developing countries, are embracing the multi-stakeholder governance, not only in Geneva. So I think that's a problem, and we will see that more, as I said, in the context of the treaty discussions. And just sort of touching upon your recommendations. Some of the recommendations are really interesting and bold. But one thing I would like to draw attention is you suggest establishing a UN system registry for transnational corporations, and those institutions seeking to benefit from COVID type crisis. I think this is really interesting because we really don't have anything like an international government. And therefore, it's very difficult to map influences, and a registry like this will be crucial going forward in at least mapping the extent of interest. So I'll stop at that, and lots of questions for you as we head to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Preeti. Those were really incisive comments. Harris, I'd like to give the floor back to you now in response to Lauren and Preeti, and then we'll take questions from the Q&A that Juliana and Gonzalo are collecting. Harris, would you like to come back on the comments?
Lauren, Preeti, thank you very much for your comments on the paper and the approach. And I think that one of the things which we are trying to highlight is if we set as a principle that global public goods for healthcare is the central principle we're trying to get to, as reflected in part in the Sustainable Development Goals. And we're running up against a normalcy. Don't treat this as an emergency. Don't treat this as a global public good. We want to stay in our normal arrangements. And I think that we need to look at this narrative, and I think both of your comments are in that same space, and to say, at some point, global crises require global structural differences. We have to structurally do something different. And I think that comes to the issue of how we govern. And the discussions around the pandemic treaty are going to be very important. Discussions about what the UN might do at 2023's Summit for the Future, because we're trying to develop a new narrative and a new set of institutional moves that reacts to the fact that the world is fundamentally changing through a whole range of crises. And normalcy, the old way of doing it, is part of the reason we have a problem today and cannot simply be the thing to preserve. It won't work. We need a new vision. We need a new way of figuring out what democratic governance is. Thank you again, both, for your comments.
Thank you, Harris. We did invite people to put questions in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screens. Juliana and Gonzalo, have you collected some questions for Harris and Lauren and Preeti?
We have, and Preeti has them, I believe, right now, so she will be able to share with you.
Yeah, we've had a few questions. So first one is from Remco van de Pas, and he is asking whether the Geneva Global Health Hub has researched pandemic treaty negotiations, on governance and finance. How does Harris see multi-stakeholderism being curtailed or not in the negotiations? And how do we ensure democratic legitimacy? Harris and maybe Lauren, if you want to respond to this.
Lauren, why don't you go first?
You're putting me on the spot. So maybe to address a part of that question, which is the question about democratic legitimacy. And I'm not sure that I can answer it, but I can flag something that I think is of concern in these kind of multi-stakeholder initiatives, which is that the global level is so far removed from communities. And yet we see, for example, in the international health regulations, in one of the annexes, there is a reference to communities, for example, being important in terms of surveillance of outbreaks. We know in the COVID pandemic, communities, specifically community health workers, have often been described as kind of the foot soldiers or at the front line of the pandemic response. So I think in terms of legitimacy, one of the key things to think about is in these kind of global governance mechanisms, for me, a key kind of criterion for legitimacy is how do you include community members, not only in kind of implementing, so surveillance, emergency response, but also in having a say in how pandemic preparedness and responses are undertaken. How do you do meaningful consultation? And so I think that's something very difficult because it is not only a challenge at the global level, but also sometimes at the national level. Because we've seen with COVID that many states have tended to have a kind of authoritarian response to pandemic management. Thanks.
I think it's very important to watch the debate about what the pandemic treaty will do and what it doesn't do. I think part of the realities of a stand back response is the spaces in action which are not happening. And I think that this is a helpful vantage point for seeing what parts of the better way that the multilateral system could govern the responses to pandemics are handled, and what they leave unsaid, giving spaces for direct corporate governance or multi-stakeholder governance and implementation. And as people following, as the G2H2 has done, there's a lot of debate about the nature of the scope of what this might be in the pandemic treaty. And it definitely is worth following it to see, at least in the narrative that I'm suggesting, which of the 4 different elements of power responses are going to be addressed and which are not going to be addressed. Thank you.
I just actually have an additional question building on Remco's question, which is to say, I do see reporting on this, I do see a shrinking of that space. And when they say that, consultations are being conducted, but these are not meaningful consultations. Lauren sort of alluded to it in her response. It's just that the way consultations happen, at least in forums such as the WHO, I'm not sure countries think, at least the smallest of countries do feel excluded. So what is the true meaning of consultations? And in general, I think this is something the UN system must address. How does feedback actually go back into these secretariats to actually have a concrete impact on the final outcome of these discussions? I think we have another question from Moga, and she's asking, how do we fix the lack of co-creation and inclusiveness, and how do we ensure democratic decision-making, better accountability and transparency, and how do we prevent marginalization of regional bodies, unless it is the EU? Would you like to respond?
I think what would be helpful is two different levels of response. Regional bodies should become very much more active in policymaking, in delivery, in helping to build the industries in their regions, and they should be talking to each other in formulating a common, more closely grassroots-based policy-making system. And one of the difficulties faced by the current discussion of the pandemic treaty is that there's a sense of, well, we'll leave things alone and wait until the outcome. I think the regional bodies can well take a leadership role in saying, this is what we need to do for our particular South Asian area, particular part of the Caribbean. And as I say, work with each other in developing a global response. In terms of marginalized people, I think one of the things which we might draw a lesson from is what has occurred in the past at the Committee on Food Security at the FAO. They have reached out to many of the individual agricultural spaces and worker groups, be they fisher folks or tobacco or growers of fruits and vegetables, and created separate constituencies to bring their views to the FAO. And I think that that would well work as a model that may be thought about in the healthcare field. And it's going to be a battle. It will be threatening. And that threat to power meant that in the food area, the Secretary General and the World Health Organization convened for the first time without the public engagement of the Rome organizations, all three of them, and their intergovernmental bodies, a food system summit outside the UN, precisely because the power of all those prior marginalized people beginning to express their views was becoming effective. And I think that may be a very helpful precedent to try to use in the health area, particularly in this scale of the current crisis.
Lauren, would you want to add your thoughts on ensuring greater participation of regional bodies?
Yeah, so I actually had, one of the things that came to mind in relation to regional bodies is the tension between regional bodies and bilaterals. And I think we see this, for example, on the African continent in relation to tech transfer for local manufacturing of COVID vaccines. So ostensibly there's a regional bloc that's advocating for the TRIPS waiver at the WTO. But at the same time, you have African countries agreeing to bilateral deals that range from fill and finish to maybe a more substantial technology transfer agreements. And I think there is a tension there, and unless the regions take a united political position and also harmonize the legal and regulatory frameworks, for example, on using TRIPS flexibilities, I think coordinated action will be very difficult if there's this jockeying for national kind of me first, and then at the same time trying to put forward a claim as a bloc on the global stage.
All right, thanks for that. I actually had two questions for Harris. One, you kind of touch upon it in the report. One on the role of the World Bank, during COVID-19, and now going forward with the financial intermediary fund and the kind of governance structures that they have suggested. I wonder if you would be willing to comment on the kind of implications we will see going forward in future health emergencies. And the second, on the role of the UN Secretary General, there is a perception that the role of the UN Secretary General would have been more decisive in responding to COVID-19. How would you respond to these two questions? And Lauren, feel free to jump in.
Okay, I know you're moderating, but I welcome to hear your views on some of these as well. Let me take the second one first. The Secretary General had a number of options available from his office early in the pandemic, and this applies to other global crises. The UN has enormous convening power, and the Secretary General could have brought together the heads of all the UN agencies and invited them to a meeting that said, I want to make sure that you get direct briefings from the World Health Organization on the way this crisis will affect education, work, women, labor questions, food issues, and invite all the intergovernmental bodies to put on their agenda early the causes in their spheres and the consequences on their spheres to get an integrated response, and could have mapped this initiative by reconvening every 4 months or so to say, this is what could be done. In fact, the Lancet Commission on COVID has a more detailed version of how the Secretary General could well have used his office to move the world in a more aggressive fashion to deal with the complexity of this mega crisis. And I think that that's what we need to encourage the Secretary General to do, rather than following the track of a partnership with the World Economic Forum and saying multistakeholderism is the inevitable future. The inevitable future would be there only if the multilateral system concedes its space. And unfortunately, the Secretary General is doing that at the moment. I'm speaking, I know, as a former staff member, I understand the pressure in the office, but I think that a much more coherent, system-wide approach would have made a major difference at this time. On the World Bank and on financing. As Lauren was saying, one of the things which is a message in the response to this crisis is that even the large number of vaccines going through COVAX are being required to be purchased. Countries who don't have, as it were, set aside money for this level of crisis. And they are then being told, well, go to the World Bank and the IMF, and they will loan you more money in order to put you more in debt, but it will at least address a crisis of the moment. This is the wrong cycle. The normal UN humanitarian response for hurricanes, floods, destructions, when the UN puts together a humanitarian team, the resources provided are provided for free. And the increasing indebtedness of the country in order to meet this particular crisis, weakens the national states in many southern countries. And I think that what we are needing to grapple with is that we're in a different world. We need to explore what's the correct narrative to describe power. And we have to open our eyes to saying there are other ways in which power can be used and that civil society organizing efforts can be directed to get a better outcome of this process. Thank you.
Thanks. Lauren, do you want to come in on this, on the question of financing? And
yeah, maybe not on like pandemic preparedness financing per se, but just to say that one of the parts of the report that really struck me as very, very crucial is the emphasis on debt and debt forgiveness. Because I think that's something, as Harris mentioned just now, that really continues to an ongoing slow crisis that is being intensified in the context of COVID. And it will have severe consequences for all kinds of social services, including healthcare in the coming years. And I think that's particularly worrisome in the context of another global discourse, which is advocacy for a shift towards universal health coverage, which is implemented as a kind of private insurance-driven model of universal health coverage. So again, there's this crisis, there's debt, and then there's an opportunity to monetize on the crisis through privatization, for example, of healthcare services. And so the systemic picture looks bleak.
right, thanks a lot. I just wanted to add sort of two observations, if you will, in the context of the pandemic treaty discussions, or pandemic accord, as the WHO now calls it. Initially, it's now done and decided that this will be under the WHO, but initially there were suggestions that they should move to New York because there's a perception that the UN is more inclusive and democratic than WHO, and it has a wider remit and mandate to actually draft a comprehensive legal instrument that goes beyond health in some sense. But that's also a power struggle in some sense. And on World Bank, I think it's early days yet, but my understanding is a lot of civil society organizations and others, including in global health, other actors in global health, are not happy with the World Bank hosting the financial intermediary fund and not having potentially enough space for democratic decision making other than key donors, from what we understand. There's just one other question. This is from Sylvia. One of the core issues is balancing the power of business of non-state actors with larger political subjects in the form of regional alliances. Do you think that they could have the power to reintroduce multilateralism?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, it's worded in a slightly complicated way. So basically, the question is one way to balance the power of business and non-state actors with larger political subjects is through regional alliances. Do you think that regional alliances could potentially rebalance, secure multilateralism?
Yeah, I think that regional alliances, and well aware of the issues that Lauren is raising about the internal tensions within regional groups, are another platform for strengthening both the regional approach, because there are fundamentally different ways in which the markets are structured, the cultural realities occur, the relationships between countries are aligned, that give a different way and a potentially a new door for bringing in many of the local constituency groups who don't need to travel to a Geneva or a New York or a Vienna, even given the use of the web, in order to get the views well put into the global debate. And I think that there are spaces for doing that are at the moment underutilized. I think that one of the ways in which we need to think about the quick expansion of multi-stakeholderism is to think of innovative ways of using existing state-based structures as one of the ways of countering the switch of power to multi-stakeholderism and to corporate capture writ large. Thank you.
Lauren, I was wondering if you could come in on this. It actually also follows up on what you said before with the question, the discussions around the TRIPS waiver and various national and regional positions. I was also wondering whether, given the diversity of interests within regions, whether it's Africa or Asia, it is difficult to get countries together, and we will see this as a challenge even in the discussions in the pandemic accord for regions to take collective positions. Is that really that simple? Because developing countries as a bloc is really diverse. So I'm not sure whether we should be optimistic about the power of regional alliances, as it were.
I'm not optimistic, but I do think on the global stage, if regional blocs from so-called developing or LMIC countries act collectively, their voice is amplified. So I think it gives them a greater shot at actually changing the decisions that are made at the global level. I think also in terms of what Harris said about, traveling to specific places to impact decision-making. I've been seeing a lot of complaints on Twitter about the big AIDS conference, right? And people simply not being able to access this conference that's historically been open to civil society and people from the South attending. So there is also the political but pragmatic reality that when we do have regional meetings, local meetings, the accessibility is very different and people can impact those processes in a different way. Also because I think the cultural idioms that people express themselves in are more familiar, right? So it's not potentially as alienating as spaces in the global north. But I mean, I think the another complicating factor, and I think the report really emphasizes this over and over again, is even if regional organizations act in unison, the risk is still that they act in unison in order to kind of promote this normalization of market-based interventions. And that's a problem because it doesn't mean then that regional representation actually shifts us towards a reality where health is seen as a global public good, where it's taken out of TRIPS. All of these other bigger goals are then jeopardized.
Prati, let me come back with one other observation. In the three areas where the North says we're fighting COVID, but are actually protecting globalization, looking to expand their power, or the stand back and let the consequences be devastating. One of the elements that drives multi-stakeholderism in this process is the financing question and the perceptions of those financing questions. State monies coming in to address global issues, the governments go back to normal practice and say it can only come from our development aid budget. This is one of those falling back to normalcy approaches, which we need to open up. Countries have massive defense budgets, have massive other budgets in other areas, whose resources are available to the state to move to affect a global crisis, particularly, and now the relevance I'm going to argue about the nature of a silent war. This means that some of the ways in which conflicts result in large deaths for people because we know that non-action can result in that, that monies can be moved from other parts of the OECD country and developed country budgets to address this, and they can not say we don't have the resources unless they're accepting the stand back approach and its consequences. But but the space provided to drive multi-stakeholderism is that there isn't the apparent money. The Bill Gates Foundation, Wellcome Foundation, others come in and say, but we have cash. And therefore, if we are the central or crucial part of the organizing outside the multilateral system, if you want access to that capital, come with us to multi-stakeholderism and walk away from the multilateral arena. But they then say quite publicly, governments, give us the money. Don't give it, in this case, to the World Health Organization. So I think that there's a big driver around capital and the movement of capital within the public space, in addition to the movement of capital with opening new markets around global emergencies that really needs to be a central part of understanding how power is behaving.
Lauren, do you want to come in on this?
No, thank you. I'm happy for.
So actually, there are a number of questions, on the problematic that multistakeholderism raises. There's one. Nicoletta asks, how would you respond to the fact that a number of civil society organizations actually favor multi-stakeholderism as the one way in which civil society gets recognized and engaged? How would you respond to that?
The multilateral environment, as I was indicating, both for the World Health Assembly and the direction that the Secretary General has been going, is not providing the leadership it should. And so I can well understand civil society activists saying, let's go somewhere closer to where there is power. And as I was saying before, where there's apparently new money. And reach out and engage with them, because we're not getting it through the multilateral system in the way in which it should be doing it. And so for those who are struggling to address the devastation from COVID, particularly in the global South and other marginalized communities, there's a really hard challenge. How do we address the moral and urgent need to provide diagnostic care, treatment, and other medical, oxygen and other medical requirements, when we are not getting the resources that are necessary to do that? And so the pressure then becomes, well, let's join a multi-stakeholder group because it looks like that they're able to do something differently. And I think that one of the things which is crucial, and I think Preti was referring to this about the constant changes in the structure of Act A and in COVAX, is they're realizing they can't do it. They didn't do it. And this tension is hard for those who are seriously trying to address in daily life and in the area around them, how to move forward in the short term. So I recognize that, but I think that the fundamental things is we have to figure out multi-directional responses to any of these global mega crises. And I think that is a demand that's going to be ongoing, is to figure out how to deal with power.
There is a related question on how do we, there is probably at some level recognition that this is multi-stakeholderism is a problem, but not many people, especially within the UN system, are able to criticize it. How can we change this and get people to dare to speak more specifically on this? Is that even possible?
There are parts of the UN who are trying to figure out how to respond as individuals within the structures. And I think that some of the work around the financing for development debates, some of the big work around the sustainable development goals and the implementation of those goals, some of the work around planning for a potential Summit for the Future conference in 2023, or in fact, I understand it may be 2024, are all looking at ways in which to make it a push to move in a different direction. When the Secretary General first put the idea of a major conference about the future in 2023, he labeled it a multi-stakeholder summit for the future. Governments in New York looked at that, particularly in the General Assembly and in the group of 77, and they said, no, we're not in agreement that multi-stakeholderism should define the future. And they went to the Secretary General as a group and said, no, this is an unacceptable undermining of the General Assembly. And if you now will watch the public language in this area, it is now the word multi-stakeholder as no longer a preface to the call for a summit for the future. It's strictly a summit for the future. And the General Assembly, and which means parts of the Secretariat with their support, are developing intergovernmental ways to try to figure out how to respond. And I think that you're seeing something similar actually in the FAO, and the governments at the FAO and the civil society are saying the World Food System Summit did not address the food crisis, and we need to do something different.
So we have one last question from Sakiko Fukudapar, and maybe Lauren, I go to you first, and then I come to Harris. So who would be the champions of a pushback to the new multi-stakeholderism? What kinds of alliances can be formed? We touched upon regional organizations, but what about an alliance of individual global South governments, civil society networks, and progressive foundations? Where do you think this challenge to multi-stakeholderism will come from? Lauren.
So I think in a sense, Harris helped me by answering parts of this question in his previous response. And so certainly it seems to be that governments, at least behind the scenes, are pushing back. I think perhaps also COVAX, which I think has been a failure. I mean, it's not done what it set out to do. And I think, maybe that in itself is an opportunity to use as a kind of a case study or entry point to start having a conversation about how these multi-stakeholder initiatives look better than they are. So they kind of promise a lot more than they deliver. I think that's particularly important because we are in this moment now of trying to codify what a response to public health emergencies looks like. And so I think to get a kind of honest reckoning of multi-stakeholder initiatives is a first step. At the same time, I think, the national governments that push back against multi-stakeholderism are unlikely to keep doing so unless their feet is being kept to the fire, so to speak, by their own citizens. And I think that's the big challenge because this governance infrastructure is so abstract and it is so removed from everyday life. And so I think for us, social movements or, people that really do believe that you should be able to have a say in what happens to your life, that's the challenge, how to make the abstraction concrete.
Thank you. Harris, do you want to come in on this?
I think that, in a period of time where the stand back approach is probably one of the dominant realities that we are facing. In other areas, in climate, we have known well for decades what non-action will do in the global South and to marginalized people. And the systemic response of not acting in that face is quite powerful. And I think it's helpful for us to realize that this form of silent warfare is one that needs to be responded to in the similar ways in which we have done demilitarized camp efforts around hot wars, or efforts to have people-to-people exchanges to deal with Cold Wars. We need to organize that takes that into a reality across a number of different dimensions. I think that that's a key response of that reorganization provides us a space for conversations about what global democratic governance would look like or should look like. And I think that I'm very pleased to join in this kind of conversation, because I think that these kinds of ways of opening up ideas is the first step. Lauren was saying that, and Prati, you've been saying that in other ways, is actually a necessary first step.
Thank you so much. There have been lots of questions, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of you. I'll just conclude by saying that I think for me as an observer, what's really important is to acknowledge the problem, as Lauren said, and we really need to map the extent of influence. And I think that evidence is really powerful, and that could be more persuasive and ultimately more impactful in presenting the evidence to various stakeholders that this is the real meaning of multi-stakeholderism, the kind of greenwashing that we have been seeing, and really asking questions of institutions such as the WHO, that has really embraced this model without questioning, no matter the pressure on financing, because ultimately it impinges on governance. Thanks so much, and I will hand over back to Fiona.
Thanks, Preeti, and thanks to all of you. I was just thinking about what we're learning from all of this. I think the work of Harris and the People's Working Group on Multistakeholderism in kind of mapping and raising awareness of really what's going down here. Oh, is my video not on? Sorry. Right. I think it's really important to understand how fast this shift, this effective outsourcing of global governance to profit-making companies, how fast this is going, and the extent, well, the price which is willing to be paid to defend a system that has been put in place in the past few decades. It threatens us all. It threatens democracy. It is not going to help us address global crises. It's not going to help us address inequality, and it bodes very, very badly for how the world is going to deal with the consequences of the global crises that climate change is going to bring in the coming years. So I'm really grateful to Harris for having put this on our agenda, to the People's Working Group for coming together to map this, and the members of the People's Working Group are mapping this in different social sectors. And there is a publication that maybe Juliana could put in the chat, where you can see the initial work that's been done to map all these multi-stakeholder forums and their agendas. I want to thank Harris very much, Lauren and Preeti for your comments, your observations, your suggestions, your recommendations, your insights, and to thank all of you who came today to start this discussion. And this is just the beginning. So we will be producing more stuff, and we will be doing some more webinars on this theme. So we hope that you will join us for those. So thanks very much to all of you.
And thank you to my co-panelists and moderators for the time and effort that you put in to make this thing happen. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.